revolution. So Pilate then says, I don't find anything wrong with him. I don't think he's guilty of these charges.
Pilate then decides on what he thinks is a masterstroke. There is a Passover amnesty, which allows the Roman governor to release a prisoner. He offers the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, who is imprisoned for murder. At this point, Pilate is plunged into an even greater dilemma. In Matthew's Gospel, Pilate's wife comes to him, deeply upset. She begs her husband not to harm Jesus. Last night, she had a dream in which Jesus was innocent. But Pilate is interrupted by the crowd, baying for him to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Unable to make a clear decision, Pilate tries to have it both ways. He passes an extraordinary sentence. Declaring Jesus to be innocent, Pilate nevertheless condemns him to death by crucifixion. This action alone is enough to incriminate Pilate as a suspect. Pilate then symbolically washes his hands before the crowd, telling them he is innocent of this man's blood. Jesus is taken away to be whipped. But for all his attempts to wash his hands of the affair, the very fact that Jesus was crucified puts Pilate firmly under suspicion. Pilate could argue, in his defense, that it was his duty as Roman governor to execute rebels who threatened the state. So was Pontius Pilate the man who killed Jesus? He had the power, but it was Caiaphas who had the motive. Pilate gave the execution order, but the crowd were shouting for it, demanding crucifixion. So the case against Pilate remains unproven. But there was one more suspect. He was at the heart of the action every step of the way, and many experts believe that he, more than anyone else, was truly responsible for the death of Jesus. To examine the evidence, we go back a little, to the start of Passover week. Like hundreds of other pilgrims, Jesus travelled to Jerusalem. His entry into the city is now legend. Riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. On the face of it, a very simple event. But there is more going on here than meets the eye. This action by Jesus is deeply provocative. Since the days of Moses, the Hebrew scriptures have foretold the arrival of a great Messiah, a powerful leader appointed by God who would bring a perfect golden age, the defeat of all evil, and a new kingdom of God on earth. One of the prophets, Zechariah, foretold that the Messiah would enter the city of Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Exactly what Jesus did.
It seems as though for Jesus, all sorts of bits of Israel's story are coming together, and that he's in the middle of it. The particular prophecy that he seems to be deliberately acting out is about Israel's true king, the anointed one, the Messiah, coming at last, and he will be God's agent to redeem Israel. So Jesus seems to be saying, this is it. This Passover is the moment when I am going to be revealed, if you like, as the true Messiah. So it's very much about his perception of who he was in the plan of God at that moment.
The final suspect is Jesus himself. There is a considerable body of evidence to suggest that every action he took was deliberately planned and that he knew what the consequences would be. Controversial though it was, his triumphant arrival in Jerusalem would not have been enough to get Jesus killed. But he didn't stop there. He raised the stakes. For years, money changers and the sellers of animals and birds for sacrifice had plied their trade in the temple courtyards. Passover is their busiest and most lucrative time of the year. People are paying their annual temple tax, which Jews from all over the world paid to the temple in Jerusalem. But the rate of exchange was appallingly bad. Declaring that the temple was a house of prayer and not a den of thieves, Jesus took his most provocative action in this whole extraordinary week. This was an attack on the commercial activity of the money changers, but it was, above all, a symbolic attack on the temple itself.
I think we can be sure that Jesus knew the risks he was taking, that he knew the potential consequences. He knew what it meant to proclaim the temple's destruction, to claim that a new kingdom was forming, the kingdom of God. He knew that the risk was arrest and trial and conviction and death.
The case for seeing Jesus as being wholly complicit in his own fate becomes more and more compelling as these dramatic days unfold. After his battle with the money changers in the temple, Jesus could easily have left Jerusalem. He could have avoided any possible trouble. Instead, he chose to stay in the city and celebrate Passover with his disciples. There are clear signs at the Last Supper that Jesus was aware that his future may now be sealed. As he and his disciples sat together, Jesus called the bread they were eating his broken body and referred to the red wine they drank as his spilled blood. Jesus seemed to be predicting his own death, and he seemed to be doing everything possible to bring that end closer. His very next action bears out that idea all too clearly. Jesus identifies the person who will betray him, Judas Iscariot, one of his own chosen disciples. In one of the Gospels, Jesus says to Judas, "Do what you have to do, but do it quickly." To put himself directly in the path of danger, and so consistently, might suggest that Jesus was undergoing some kind of crisis. But we have to remember that he believed profoundly that he was on a mission from God.
We know from several points in the Gospels that Jesus' own family said he's out of his mind. We know that some of the people who listened to his teaching said he's absolutely crazy, why bother listening to him? And then when you find yourself on trial for your life because of this vision that you've got, this vocation that you've got, then again the question must come, maybe I've made a terrible mistake. And I am quite sure that Jesus must have faced that question again and again and again during his life, and that each time he faced it, he came back with the same answer. No, it may look crazy, but this is what I have to do.
There is one final incident during this night that confirms Jesus was fully aware of what he was doing. After the Last Supper, he and the disciples went to the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside the city walls. The Gospels say that here, for the first time, Jesus began to have doubts about his destiny. They describe the event as the agony of Jesus. He asked God if he could be spared the awful fate that awaited him. It's at this point that Jesus' complicity in his own death is fully revealed. According to Luke's Gospel, Jesus sweats blood, and drops of his blood fall on the path before him. Scholars have always assumed that this was a detail made up by the Gospel writer, a dramatic literary device to express Jesus' fear and anxiety. But forensic pathology suggests that this event may actually have happened, giving us our best evidence yet that Jesus knew the fate that lay before him.
Physicians refer to the fact that each of the sweat glands that are all over our body is supplied by small capillaries, small blood vessels. Under stress, capillaries can break and blood can issue forth into the sweat itself and be a mixture of sweat and blood. The medical name for that is hematohidrosis, blood sweat.
If you read Luke, the Gospels, and you find out that Jesus sweated blood, I'm not surprised. I mean, the mind-body relationship has been known for a long time, that when you're under enormous stress, it can come out in some form. In his form, with a very, very rare condition, but stimulated by stress. And confronted in the garden, ready to be taken off for a trial. This is a time of maximum stress, and in one form or another, it's going to come out. And it came out in a very rare form of sweating blood.
The idea of Jesus being complicit in his own death may seem controversial, but all the facts stack up. On many occasions, Jesus had the opportunity to leave Jerusalem. But every time he refused to take the easy way out. At no time during this fateful week did Jesus make any attempt to escape. He stood his ground. Judas betrayed him with a kiss, and the awful end game began. Everything he had done since that first day at the gates of Jerusalem, every step of the way seemed to be the fulfillment of a destiny. The case against Jesus is strong. But no matter how often he put himself in danger, he did not take his own life. That was done by others. Let's review the evidence. The first suspect, Caiaphas, wanted Jesus dead. He considered Jesus a threat to his religious power and his privileged lifestyle. He held a sham trial and convicted Jesus of blasphemy.
Who is the guilty party is naturally Caiaphas. And I think that that's the right man to name. He is the guy who decided. So here's the man that I think is actually the guy who did it.
Pilate may have played an unwitting role in this crime. He saw Jesus as no threat. He declared him innocent. But Pilate had the ultimate power. It was he who ordered the execution of Jesus.
Of course, the one who convicted him and sentenced him to death was Pilate, the Roman governor. No question about that. Pilate has to take the responsibility for that.
The final suspect, Jesus. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. He deliberately provoked Caiaphas with his actions. He made no attempt to escape, and he refused to defend himself at his trial. Jesus was successful in achieving his goal, his destiny.
I think ultimately it was Jesus